The summer of 2023 felt heavier than usual in the quiet Cotswolds village of Lower Slaughter. I had just turned 19 and was spending the long university break helping my Uncle Tom and Aunt Eleanor renovate their old stone cottage on the edge of the valley. The house smelled permanently of fresh plaster, wood shavings, and the faint lavender that Eleanor always kept in bowls around the kitchen. Tom was a landscape architect who traveled frequently for work. That particular Friday, he had driven their youngest, 11-year-old Jamie, to a week-long football camp in Gloucestershire, leaving the house unusually still. Eleanor had waved them off from the front gate wearing a pale linen sundress printed with tiny cornflowers, her dark hair loosely tied back, the afternoon sun catching the faint freckles across her nose. I was upstairs in the spare bedroom turned storage, sorting through decades of boxes, when I heard her call up the narrow oak staircase. "Ethan, could you give me a hand with something in the sitting room?" I wiped dust from my palms and went down. She stood on the low stepladder beneath the large Georgian window, reaching for an old gilt-framed mirror that had hung there since before I was born. The ladder wobbled slightly on the uneven flagstones. "Hold it steady for me, love," she said without turning. "I do not fancy crashing through the glass." I stepped behind her and gripped the wooden legs. From this angle, I could smell the light citrus of her shampoo mixed with the warm skin scent that always seemed to linger around her. She stretched higher, the hem of her dress riding up just enough to show the backs of her thighs. I looked away quickly, cheeks burning, and concentrated on keeping the ladder level. "Almost. There," she murmured. The mirror came free, with a soft scrape. She began her descent, one careful foot after the other. On the third rung her sandal slipped on a smear of old paint I had not noticed. She gasped, arms windmilling. Instinctively, I let go of the ladder and caught her around the waist as she fell backwards. We landed in a soft tangle on the faded Persian rug. Her back pressed against my chest, my arms still locked around her middle. For several heartbeats, neither of us moved. I could feel the rapid rise and fall of her breathing through the thin fabric of her dress. My own pulse hammered in my ears. "Bloody hell," she whispered, half laugh, half exhale. "Thank you." She made no immediate attempt to stand. Instead, she tilted her head just enough that I caught the corner of her mouth, curving into something that was not quite a smile. Slowly, she reached back and rested her fingers lightly over mine, where they rested on her stomach. "You are shaking," she said softly. "So are you." A long silence stretched between us. Outside, a blackbird sang from the apple tree. Inside, the grandfather clock in the hall ticked steadily onward. Eventually, she shifted, turning in my arms until we were face to face on the rug. Her eyes hazel flecked with gold searched mine. A strand of hair had come loose and lay against her cheek. I lifted my hand without thinking and tucked it behind her ear. My fingertips brushed the warm skin just below her earlobe, and she closed her eyes for a second. "We should not," she said, voice barely above a breath. "I know." But neither of us moved away. Her hand found the side of my neck. Her thumb traced the line of my jaw, slow and deliberate. Then she leaned in and kissed me soft at first, testing, as though waiting for one of us to pull back. When I did not, the kiss deepened. My hand slid to the small of her back, drawing her closer. She tasted faintly of the iced tea we would shared at lunch, sweet and cool. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. She rested her forehead against mine. "This is madness," she whispered. "Yes." Another pause. Then she asked, almost too quietly to hear, "Do you want to stop?" I shook my head. She exhaled a shaky laugh. "Then we are both fools." She stood first, smoothing her dress with hands that still trembled slightly. I followed. Without another word, she took my hand and led me through the house, past the kitchen, up the back stairs to the master bedroom she shared with Tom. The room was cool, curtains half drawn against the afternoon glare. Sunlight slanted across the white linen bedspread in golden bars. She closed the door behind us and turned the key in the old brass lock. For a moment, we simply stood there, looking at each other across the small space between us. Then she reached behind her neck, unfastened the top button of her dress, and let the fabric slide down her shoulders. I crossed the distance in 2 steps. What followed was careful and urgent at once. We moved slowly, learning each other with a kind of reverence that made my chest ache. Her skin was warm, softer than I had imagined. She whispered my name once, twice, like a question and an answer in the same breath. When it was over, we lay tangled in the sheets, listening to each other breathe, the house quiet around us except for the distant drone of bees in the garden. Afterwards, she traced invisible patterns on my chest with one fingertip. "We can't ever speak of this outside these walls," she said. "I know. And when Tom comes back tomorrow, I will be the helpful nephew again. Nothing more." She nodded, but her eyes were troubled. "It changes everything, even if we pretend it does not." I press my lips to her temple. Then we pretend very carefully. We stayed like that until the light began to fade and the first shadows crept across the floorboards. Only then did she slip from the bed, gather her dress, and disappear into the en-suite bathroom. I heard the shower start. I dressed in silence, straightened the bed, and went downstairs to make tea as though nothing extraordinary had happened. When she came down 20 minutes later, her hair was damp and she wore jeans and an old university sweatshirt. She looked exactly like the aunt I had always known, composed, kind, slightly amused at the world. She accepted the mug I offered her and sat at the kitchen table. "Jamie's camp ends next Saturday," she said conversationally. "Tom's picking him up on the way back from Birmingham." I nodded. "I will probably head back to Bristol on Sunday then." A small silence. "Will you come back next holiday?" she asked. "If you want me to." She looked at me over the rim of her mug. I think we both know the answer to that. We finished our tea without touching again. Later, when the house was dark and I lay in the spare room listening to the creak of old timber settling, I replayed every moment in my mind until sleep finally took me. The next morning, Tom's car pulled into the drive just after 10. Jamie burst through the front door shouting about goals and penalties. Tom followed more slowly, carrying a sports bag and looking tired but pleased. Eleanor greeted them both with hugs and questions about the week. I helped unload the car, carried Jamie's muddy kit to the laundry room, answered Tom's questions about the progress on the upstairs bathroom. Everything was perfectly normal. Only once, when I passed Eleanor in the narrow hallway carrying a stack of clean towels, did our eyes meet. She gave me the smallest, most private smile, gone in an instant. But it was enough. The following autumn passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. I returned to Bristol for my second year of university, but the distance between the city and the Cotswolds felt thinner than it ever had. Messages arrived at odd hours, Eleanor sending photos of the garden now ablaze with crimson and gold, or a quick snap of Jamie's latest school project. Each one carried a hidden weight. A simple miss, the chaos you bring to the house beneath the picture of fallen leaves, could make my pulse jump. Christmas came early that year, the first proper family gathering since the summer. Tom's parents hosted at their larger farmhouse near Bourton on the Water. The house smelled of cinnamon, pine, and mulled wine. Relatives filled every room. Children raced up and down the creaking stairs. Eleanor arrived wearing a deep green wool dress that hugged her figure without trying too hard. When she hugged me hello in the crowded hallway, her fingers pressed briefly into the small of my back longer than necessary, but gone before anyone could notice. Throughout the day, our eyes kept finding each other across rooms. A shared glance while carving the turkey. A fleeting smile when she passed me a plate of mince pies. Once, when everyone else had drifted into the drawing room for charades, I found her alone in the kitchen refilling the kettle. The door swung shut behind me. She did not turn immediately. "You are terrible at pretending," she murmured. "So are you." She set the kettle down and faced me. The overhead light caught the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, lines I suddenly wanted to trace with my fingertips. "We said we would be careful," she reminded me. "I am being careful. I have not touched you since July." Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then lifted again. "That is the problem, is not it?" Someone called her name from the other room. She straightened, smoothed her dress, and walked past me, brushing my arm just enough to send heat racing under my skin. Boxing Day, we all drove to the coast Brighton, though the wind was bitter and the pebble beach looked gray under heavy clouds. The family scattered along the promenade, Jamie and the cousins building elaborate windbreaks with deck chairs, Tom and his brothers arguing good-naturedly about football scores. Eleanor and I ended up walking together towards the old pier, coats buttoned to the throat. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face. She stopped at the railing and looked out at the churning sea. "I have been thinking," she said. "That is dangerous." She gave a small, rueful laugh. "Tom's been offered a 6-month contract in Edinburgh. Starting February. He will be away most of the time." I waited. "Jamie will stay with me. The house will be quiet." My heart thudded once, hard. "You are asking me to visit," I said. "I am saying the door will be unlocked on certain weekends." She turned to face me fully. "If you want to come." I looked down the pier. Far away, Jamie was waving a bright plastic spade at us. I lifted my hand in automatic reply. When I asked, "First weekend in March. Tom leaves the Thursday before." I nodded once. "I will be there." We walked back to the others without touching, without speaking again. But the promise sat between us like a live wire. March arrived cold and damp. Tom left for Scotland on schedule. I told my flatmates I was visiting an old school friend in Oxford. Instead, I took the train to Moreton in Marsh, then a taxi through winding lanes to Lower Slaughter. Eleanor met me at the gate wearing jeans and a thick cream jumper. No makeup, hair in a loose braid. She looked younger, softer, almost nervous. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and the roast she had already put in the oven. Jamie was at a sleepover with a friend from school. He would not be back until Sunday afternoon. We stood in the hallway for a long moment, coats still on. Then she stepped forward and kissed me slow, deliberate, like she had been waiting months to do it properly. I backed her gently against the wall, hands framing her face. The kiss turned hungry very quickly. We did not make it upstairs that first time. Later, wrapped in blankets on the sofa in front of the fire, she rested her head on my chest. "I keep telling myself this is wrong," she whispered. "Do you believe it?" "Sometimes." She lifted her chin to look at me. "Other times I can't remember why it matters." We spent the weekend in a kind of bubble, cooking together, reading in the same room, walking the footpaths when the rain eased, hands brushing accidentally on purpose. Saturday night, we drove to a quiet pub 10 miles away, far enough that no one would recognize us. We sat in a dim corner booth and talked about everything and nothing. For 2 hours, we were simply a woman and a man. No titles, no guilt. Sunday morning came too soon. Jamie returned at noon, full of stories about fortnight and midnight snacks. I helped him unpack his overnight bag, while Eleanor watched from the kitchen doorway, expression unreadable. When I left that evening, she walked me to the car. Next time, she said quietly. Next time, I agreed. The pattern continued through spring and into early summer. Short visits, stolen weekends, always careful, always aware of the clock ticking down to Tom's return or Jamie's arrival. In July, we risked more. Tom had taken Jamie to visit his parents in Devon for a week. Eleanor suggested we meet somewhere neutral Cornwall. She booked a small stone cottage above a cove near Polzeth. I drove down on the Friday evening. She arrived separately the next morning. The cottage overlooked the sea. Slate floors, low ceilings, windows that rattled in the wind. We barely left the bedroom for the first day. On Sunday afternoon, we walked the headland path. The sun was fierce. She wore a wide straw hat and a white sundress that fluttered around her legs. Halfway along the path, where the gorse gave way to a sheltered dip, she pulled me behind a large boulder. Here, I asked, half laughing. Here, she confirmed. We were quick and desperate. The sound of waves crashing below us, the smell of salt and crushed grass thick in the air. Afterwards, we sat with our backs against the rock, breathing hard, laughing at how reckless we had become. That evening, back at the cottage, she turned serious. Tom wants to talk about the future when he gets back, she said. About us. About whether there is still in us. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. And what will you tell him? She looked out at the darkening sea. The truth is too cruel. I will tell him we have grown apart. That we need space. I reached for her hand, and after, she turned to me. After, we see what happens when the pretending stops. We left the cottage separately on Monday morning. I drove north with the windows down, the taste of salt still on my lips, her final kiss still burning against my mouth. Summer ended. Autumn came again. The messages grew fewer, the meetings more charged, as though we both understood that something had to give soon. And then, one rainy November evening, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. Tom's moving out, she said. Next week. I closed my eyes. The line crackled softly. I think, she continued, it is time we stopped hiding. The divorce was quiet, almost polite. Papers were signed in a solicitor's office in Cheltenham on a gray February morning in 2024. Tom kept the Edinburgh flat and most of the London investments. Eleanor kept the cottage in Lower Slaughter, the small inheritance from her mother, and Jamie 50-50. There were no raised voices, no courtroom drama. Just two people who had once loved each other acknowledging that the feeling had run dry long before anyone else noticed. I stayed away that week. Eleanor asked me to. It needs to be clean, she said over the phone. No shadows. I waited in Bristol, counting days. When she finally texted 3 simple words, it is done. Come. I drove straight down without stopping. She opened the door in bare feet and an oversized cardigan that had once belonged to Tom. Her eyes were red-rimmed but calm. She did not speak at first, just stepped aside to let me in and closed the door behind us. Then she walked into my arms and stayed there for a long time, face pressed to my shoulder, breathing slow and deliberate. I am not sad, she murmured eventually. I am just untethered. I held her tighter. Jamie was with his father that weekend. The house felt bigger without the small sounds of a child's sneakers on the stairs, cartoons in the background, We moved carefully through the rooms like strangers testing new territory. We cooked dinner together, ate at the kitchen table instead of in front of the television, talked about ordinary things, the leaking gutter, the new neighbor's dog, my upcoming exams. Afterwards, we washed up side by side. When the last plate was dried, she turned to me, dried her hands on a tea towel, and said simply, "Stay tonight." I did. And the next night, and the one after that. We never discussed rules or timelines. It simply happened that I began leaving clothes in the spare wardrobe, that my toothbrush appeared beside hers, that Jamie, when he came home, accepted my presence with the easy pragmatism of an 11-year-old who had already weathered bigger changes. "Ethan's going to help with the garden this weekend," Eleanor told him one Friday evening. Jamie shrugged. "Cool. Can we get a trampoline?" We laughed. It felt like permission. Spring arrived. The wisteria over the front porch burst into purple cascades. I finished my second year and, instead of looking for summer internships in the city, I stayed. Eleanor had started a small online boutique selling vintage linens and hand-dyed silk scarves, things she sourced from estate sales and local makers. I helped with the photography, the packaging, the endless trips to the post office in Stowe-on-the-Wold. It was not glamorous, but it was ours. Summer 2025 brought the first real test. Tom announced he was engaged to a woman named Claire, an architect he would met in Edinburgh. He wanted Jamie to spend the month of August in Scotland to meet her properly. Eleanor agreed, though her smile was tight when she hung up the phone. The night before Jamie left, he found us in the sitting room. Eleanor was curled against my side on the sofa, reading. I was scrolling through fabric suppliers on my phone. "Are you two together now?" he asked bluntly. We both froze. Eleanor closed her book. "Yes," she said. "We are." Jamie considered this. "Okay. Is Dad going to be weird about it?" "He might be," I answered honestly. "But that is between the grown-ups. You just worry about having fun in Scotland." He nodded once, satisfied, and wandered off to pack his football boots. After his taxi disappeared down the lane the next morning, Eleanor turned to me in the empty hallway. "I thought that would be harder," she said. "Kids are resilient." She gave a small, surprised laugh. "I suppose we all are." That same summer we took our first proper holiday together, just the two of us. A week in the Lake District, renting a stone bothy above Ullswater. No phone signal, no schedule. We walked the fells until our legs ached, swam in the cold lake at dawn, cooked on a tiny camping stove. At night we lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind move through the pines, her head on my chest, my fingers tracing the curve of her spine. One evening, watching the sun sink behind Helvellyn, she said quietly, "I used to think guilt would always live here." She touched her sternum. "But it is fading. Not gone. Just quieter." I kissed her temple. "Good." When we returned home, the cottage no longer felt like a place of secrets. It was simply home. Autumn 2025. Jamie turned 13. Tom and Claire sent a generous gift card and a promise to visit at Christmas. Eleanor's business grew enough that she hired a part-time assistant, a cheerful woman from the village who never asked too many questions. I started a master's degree remotely, specializing in sustainable landscape design, partly because I loved the subject, partly because it let me stay close. Most evenings I worked at the old pine table in the kitchen, while Eleanor sewed or packed orders, a pot of tea between us. On New Year's Eve we stayed in. Jamie went to a friend's house party. We opened a bottle of champagne Eleanor had been saving, lit the fire, and danced slowly in the sitting room to an old Norah Jones record. When the clock struck midnight, she kissed me long, unhurried, tasting of bubbles and certainty. I love you, she said against my mouth. Properly. Not just the stolen kind. I pulled back just enough to see her eyes. I have loved you since that first afternoon on the rug, I told her. Every careful, reckless, impossible minute of it. She smiled open, unguarded, the way she only smiled when we were alone. Then let's keep doing it properly, she said. We married quietly in the spring of 2026, a registry office in Cirencester, then lunch at a pub on the river. Jamie stood beside us in a slightly too big suit and grinned through the entire ceremony. A handful of close friends came, none of them surprised. Most of them relieved that the pretending had finally stopped. Afterwards, we walked along the water meadows. Eleanor wore a simple cream dress and the same straw hat from Cornwall years before. I held her hand the way I had wanted to since that first summer. The future stretched ahead, ordinary and extraordinary at once. School runs, business deadlines, quiet evenings, arguments about whose turn it was to unload the dishwasher. No more shadows in hallways. No more looking over shoulders. Just us. And that, somehow, felt like the biggest risk of all and the only one worth taking.